You know what we think is scarier than most of the creepy creatures that populate the world of Berserk? Pseudo-apostles. You want to know why we're so scared of them? It's because you and I could have easily been in their place if we resided in the Berserkverse, and we couldn't have done jack about it. Apostles are abominations created when a human's immense ego and desire activates a Behelit, triggering a chain of events whereby they commit themselves to demonkind and are reincarnated as the lambs of the unholy god created by man. They possess a direct link to the Abyss, and their ascendance is always preordained by causality. Otherwise, their Behelits would simply not work. Pseudo-apostles can be thought of as their mindless, parasite-enabled personal guard, and that's what makes them terrifying. Imagine one fine day your child is carried away by some elves, only to become part of their murderous swarm that kills, violates, and devours every living thing in sight without discrimination. Well, that's a reality you'll see us discuss soon enough. But how exactly did that child become a murder elf in the first place? And what is his place in the overall food chain of Berserk? We'll explain all those questions and more in this video. This is What Are Pseudo-Apostles? Explained. They're just like apostles, but different. What distinguishes pseudo-apostles from apostles? If you've seen our video on what apostles are, and you should really check it out if you haven't, you guys should already have a basic idea of what pseudo-apostles are all about. If you haven't, we'll give you a short rundown anyway because it's relevant to this video, but it would make for a much better viewing experience if you watched the What Are Apostles video first. But getting back to the subject at hand, it's all in their naming. Pseudo-apostles are apostles, but pseudo, as they're not authentic, they're not the genuine article. An apostle is created when a human being possessing of great ego and desire comes into contact with a Behelit, activates at their most desperate hour, and opens themselves up to the possibility of transcending their weak human shells. This opens up a fissure in their hearts, which is filled with the essence of evil straight from the Abyss, but only if they make a sacrifice first that is akin to giving up a part of their own souls. Once they've done that, the fissure in their hearts surges with evil power, which gives their bodies of flesh a demonic power boost and links their souls to the Abyss itself. Oh, and all of this is preordained by fate, aka causality. So the only way for a person to escape said fate is to consciously reject the offer of incredible power and everlasting life. And you can guess which way people end up going just based off the sheer number of apostles in the story. Once they've ascended, they live life with a foot in two realms, and when their lives come to an end, they end up belonging to neither, which is the one tragic detail about the otherwise barbaric lives of apostles. To create a pseudo-apostle, these many conditions do not need to be met. There is one thing required to make a pseudo-apostle, and that is an apostle. Now, it is possible that the apostle needs to be at a certain level in order to create a pseudo, as only 4 apostles in the series have created pseudos to serve them so far. 3 of these apostles were also some of the strongest of their kind before the introduction of Griffith's War Demon commanders, so there's also that to consider. The biggest difference between pseudo-apostles and apostles in this regard is the fact that pseudos seemingly do not need to be picked out by fate. Anyone can become a pseudo-apostle. A serving knight, a band of thugs, a cult leader, a bunch of unwitting children, you get the idea. A Behelit or a sacrifice is not required in order to turn a human being into a pseudo-apostle because the apostle responsible for the creation of a pseudo stands in as a substitute for those things. The subject of Berserk's first proper retcon. Why pseudos were called daemons early on. In order to create a pseudo-apostle, an apostle needs to find a suitable enough target first. Once they've located said target, there are a bunch of ways through which they can turn them into their pseudo-minions. The first apostle who was shown creating a pseudo for himself was the Slugcount, and his method of conversion is particularly gnarly. Slugcount's captain of guards, Zondark, goes after Guts after the Black Swordsman shows up at his master's town and threatens his very life, but he ends up being humiliated by him and has his face smashed in for good measure. When he returns to the castle, he's legit losing his mind at the massive L, smashing his head into a pillar and repeatedly screaming words of vengeance directed towards Guts. Slugcount notices Zondark's intense desire to defeat the Black Swordsman and decides that he's going to help things along by giving him the tools he needs to ensure victory. He subdues Zondark after confirming his thirst for revenge and decides to grant his wish by sending a giant, hairy, parasitic slug that crawls out of his mouth and into Zondark's mouth, and it also has the Slugcount's face on it, which is just the highest level of gross and disturbing if you ask us. He even tells Zondark to take all of it inside of him, which, yes, was as disgusting to read as it was saying it out loud just now, but then Slugcount says something really interesting. He calls either Zondark or the slug baby he just infected him with, my daemon. Why is this interesting? Well, that's because this term would later be retconned and reused within the story later on in a far more appropriate historical and thematic context. See, the term daemon originates from ancient Greek, and it has a bunch of meanings depending on which source you're referring to at the time. But there were two major interpretations of the term that were prevalent back then, before daemons got categorized as spirits that were good or evil, again, based on the source you're referring to. If you Googled the term right now, you'd find a link to Merriam-Webster's online dictionary which gives you a bunch of different meanings for the term. The first one, most obviously, is that daemon is a spelling variant for the word demon, and we all know what demons are. The second one refers to them as attendant powers or spirits that watch over things, places, or people. And the third one calls them supernatural beings that were somewhere between being humans and deities. Essentially a way to call them demigods after a fashion, but it appears as though Miura used his third meaning to define the term daemon upon its initial use in the series, because pseudo-apostles are, for better or worse, supernatural entities that hang somewhere between being humans and demons. They're basically one step above regular humans and one step below proper apostles on the food chain of life in Berserk, and apostles themselves were humans at one point who have now given themselves over whole and soul to the idea of evil and tied themselves to the abyss. So if you do enough mental gymnastics, you can make their title as daemons make sense. But then Miura retconned that term and brought it back much later in the story during the Elfhelm arc, this time in its more traditional sense. Now, daemon is a term associated with the second Merriam-Webster definition of the word, guiding spirits that reside deeper in the astral realm than the interstice, who were once either humans or mages or other kinds of beings, but were all heroes in their own right. Communion with daemons is considered to be the highest honor a regular mage can hope to receive in Elfhelm, and is usually a sign that said mage is ready to become a guru themselves. Kudos to Shirke. Her mistress Flora is the only daemon we've ever seen in the series with relation to this revised meaning of the term, except if you count Skull Knight as a daemon too. Then we've seen two of them. In the context of the Slugcount and Zondark, it's possible Miura was using daemon as a term to reflect the creator-creation, master-servant dynamic that develops between them after the latter swallows the former's parasitic slug. And yes, we're about to explain what we mean by that. Infected or incubated with the essence of evil. How pseudo-apostles are made. The relationship between a pseudo and the apostle that created them is reflective of the relationship between apostles and the God Hand. Once a pseudo accepts their master's powers, they become sort of bound to their wills. When Zondark received Slugcount's slug mount, his severe injuries all healed at a terrifying pace, and he started to look like he was out of it. Zondark wasn't the brightest color in the crayon box by any means, but he became sort of inhuman after taking in the aforementioned parasite, and that's exactly what happened to him. The Slugcount was basically using Zondark as an extension of himself now. When Zondark faced off against Guts for the first time as a pseudo, his abilities and endurance were noticeably enhanced, and that's all thanks to his master's generosity. He even gains slug-like appendages like the Slugcount, which helps him increase his attack range by a considerable margin. And when Guts slices his head in twain, we actually see the Slugcount emerge from the gaping wound and challenge Guts to a showdown at his castle, whilst taunting his former physician Vargas for his betrayal. Zondark ends up being sliced and diced quite literally when Guts comes across him at the Count's castle, but he weakens the Black Swordsman enough for his master to have a thrilling fight with the lad afterward. In terms of usability, a pseudo's potential left a lot to be desired in its first appearance, simply because Zondark was just one minion, and though he was a strong minion, he was by himself regardless of his newfound abilities. Things become a lot more difficult if an apostle commands an army of pseudos, and that's exactly what Rosine from the infamous Lost Children arc does. Rosine creates two kinds of pseudo-apostles in the series. The first are insectoid guardian pseudos who take the form of gigantic lethal critters. These pseudos are created by adults that she comes across in her travels, who she deems fit to be protectors of her misty valley. The other kind is the pseudo-elves, which she creates by incubating human children within cocoons that hatch and produce monstrous elves, whose idea of a fun time is just not something we want to talk about here. Rosine's pseudo-apostles are immediately different from the Counts because not only are they numerous, there are also two broad categories of them. We can also assume that their creation process must also differ, given the fact that the Guardian Apostles turn into different kinds of bugs upon releasing their true forms, whereas the little evil elves have a similar bee-like form when entering their released states. Guts had to legit burn down a forest and unlock a new fighting move in the middle of a life and death battle like he was a video video game character in order to survive Rosine's pseudos, and the Apostle herself was likely his biggest challenge up until that point in the series. Guts had to figure out a way to deflect a stinger attack that was traveling towards him at a faster pace than the speed of sound, without even knowing what a sonic boom was. And that's downright insane if you ask us. The final type of pseudo-apostles we see in the series are those created by the Egg of the Perfect World, and these guys are completely different from any other pseudo-apostles we've seen in the series. Where the Slug Count and Rosine created pseudo-apostles that seem to match their idea of a perfect servant/companion, the Egg created pseudos that were more in line with the apostle creation process. We say this because instead of reflecting the forms that their creators desired of them, like Zondark becoming a slug-like entity or Rosine spawning multiple elves to keep her company, the Egg of the Perfect World's pseudos took a form that reflected their own inner ego and desire. The first pseudo-apostle he creates is the Great Goat, who was the figurehead of Nina's cult that operated on the outskirts of St. Albion. The Great Goat used to be just a regular dude in a goat mask with a far more perverted outlook on the world than most, but once he got hit with the egg-shaped apostle's pseudo-stinger, he became a satyr like Behemoth, reaching unparalleled speeds and strengths compared to his previous existence as a human being. This transformation also ended up amplifying his lust for Casca and gave him the snake-shaped penis that Joachim hallucinated he had when he first came to the cave with Nina. We're pretty sure that this is what the Great Goat thought his true form should be like, but that's not exactly as concrete as knowing. What we do know to be a fact, though, is that Father Mozgus's pseudo form was most definitely inspired by his own perception of himself, because how are you going to become a fire-breathing, white-feathered angel when your powers are being fueled by Berserk's equivalent of the devil? And that brings us to the creation process of a pseudo. The main ingredient needed to create a pseudo-apostle is an apostle themselves. Because pseudos are basically less efficient copies of their creators, Behelitz and causality do not come into play during their creation. An apostle uses the essence of evil that is brimming within their bodies, thanks to their now astral existence, and forms it into a suitable delivery system in order to convert their chosen servants. The Slug Count did so by sending a parasite down Zondark's throat. Rosine did it by incubating her elves in cocoons that were presumably filled with fluid that was brimming with the essence of evil. The Egg of the Perfect World straight injected this essence into his targets by stinging them with his tendrils, and Emperor Ganishka created his numerous pseudo-spawns by simply stepping on live humans and unwittingly transforming them after he himself turned into Shiva. Though this is never explicitly mentioned in the series, it's safe to assume that as long as an apostle is alive, their pseudo will be alive as well, given that they aren't killed by someone else. When an apostle dies, it's possible that any pseudos they created will pass on with them because they're all connected by the essence of evil that the apostle themselves shared with their pseudo-servants in the first place. We don't have confirmation on whether there is a link between their independent lives or not, but we do know that at their death, pseudos revert to their human forms just like apostles, which sadly implies that their souls have gone into the abyss just like an apostle's does after their death. Despite dodging most of the troublesome fate stuff that comes with being a servant of the God Hand, pseudos end up suffering the same fate as everyone else that gets tangled up with demonkind. And for them, it's actually much worse because they don't even know about it most of the time. Rosine's elves all thought they were just playing at war or following their queen's orders when they were violating and mutilating themselves. Father Mozgus genuinely thought he'd witnessed a divine revelation when he got his pseudo-powers, but we all know that it was in fact the exact opposite of what he was thinking. Though pseudo-apostles are not intrinsically linked to the major plans that causality seems to have for the world of Berserk, they do end up serving those plans inadvertently by just being themselves. One can argue that without the Great Goat and Mozgus, the incarnation ceremony could not have been the success that it was, and what makes that particular case even more tragic is that neither of them knew they were being used as pawns in the first place. Gaining superpowers without actually having to go through any of the gnarly stuff that the one bestowing them upon you had to sounds pretty amazing, but in practice, it's something that literally condemns your soul to hell in Berserk. Pseudo-apostles are a single step above humanity in the food chain of Berserk, but the trade-off that they have to make to take that step, which is giving up their own humanity, is ultimately not worth it in our opinion. Most of the pseudos we've mentioned on this list were taken down by a single guy, and yes, we know Guts literally lives for this stuff, but enough humans becoming wiser to the ways of the astral world and devising methods to combat its worst residents is also becoming a rapid reality in Berserk's world. We have 100% faith that Little Rickert could whip up something powerful enough to take out a pseudo with no effort, and if Little Ricky can do it at his age, the rest of mankind is simply making excuses for their weakness. Pseudos, while strong and useful, are not as well protected by causality in Berserk, which is why they almost always end up feeling like fodder instead of actual threats, and that's what makes their existence truly tragic, in our opinion. Marvelous verdict! But as far as this video is concerned, that's gonna have to be it. Let us know what you guys thought about pseudo-apostles and their purpose in Berserk in the comments down below. Also tell us if you want us to explore any of them individually in a separate video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Till then, keep struggling, fellow strugglers.